This is a true account, presented with care and respect for all impacted. The focus here is on understanding the investigation and what can be learned from it. True crime isn't just about what happened, it's about understanding why. If you value that approach, consider subscribing. Your support through likes helps this content reach others who think the same way. It started like this. Around midnight, on a lonely stretch of Florida highway, truck drivers sometimes notice the same woman standing near the road. Small frame, worn denim jacket, hitchhiking smile. Most people who passed her never gave her a second thought, but a few stopped. And years later, investigators would begin asking a disturbing question about those encounters. How many of those men believed they were helping someone vulnerable moments before they disappeared? At first, the cases didn't seem connected. Different counties, different victims, different stretches of road scattered across Florida. But the crime scenes carried similarities investigators couldn't ignore. Missing belongings, abandoned vehicles, gunshot wounds, and witnesses describing a woman drifting between truck stops and cheap motels along the interstate. Her name was Aileen Wuornos. And this is where things take a turn. Long before the headlines called her America's first female serial killer, Aileen Wuornos had already spent most of her life surviving chaos. She was born in Michigan in February of 1956. Her childhood was unstable almost from the beginning. Her father, Leo Pittman, had a violent criminal history and severe psychological problems. He spent time in psychiatric institutions before eventually dying in prison. Aileen never truly knew him. Her mother abandoned the family while Aileen was still very young, leaving Aileen and her brother to be raised by their grandparents. But even that home was deeply troubled. According to later interviews and court testimony, violence, alcoholism, emotional neglect, and humiliation shaped much of her early life. By the time she was a teenager, Aileen had already developed a reputation around the neighborhood. She fought often, skipped school, drifted from place to place. Some classmates later described her as aggressive. Others described her as strangely withdrawn. Those contradictions would follow her for the rest of her life. What's interesting from a psychological standpoint is how early instability can distort a person's understanding of trust and danger. Children raised in unpredictable environments often learn to see the world as hostile long before adulthood begins. For some people, that creates fear. For others, it creates aggression. And for Aileen Wuornos, it may have created both at the same time. By her early teens, she was surviving however she could. She reportedly exchanged sexual acts for money, cigarettes, food, or temporary shelter. She spent nights in abandoned buildings and wooded areas near highways. Stability never lasted long, and neither did relationships. One former acquaintance later said Aileen could completely change personalities depending on who she was talking to. Around some people, she appeared vulnerable and desperate for connection. Around others, she became confrontational almost instantly. That detail would later become extremely important. At school, she struggled constantly. Eventually, she dropped out altogether. She spent time in a home for unwed mothers after becoming pregnant as a teenager. The child was placed for adoption soon after birth. After that, her life became increasingly transient. Motels, roadsides, parking lots, short-term jobs, arrests. She drifted across states throughout her late teens and 20s, surviving through prostitution, theft, fraud, and robbery. Police records from those years painted a picture of someone spiraling deeper into instability with each passing year. But there was something else investigators would later notice. Aileen didn't just drift physically, she drifted psychologically too. There never seemed to be a stable identity underneath the stories she told. Sometimes she described herself as a victim, sometimes as a fighter, sometimes as someone simply trying to survive, and sometimes as someone angry at the entire world. That instability made her difficult to understand even for trained professionals. By the 1980s, she had settled for periods of time in Florida. The state highways became part of her daily routine. Truck stops, rest areas, bars near interstate exits. Long nights under neon signs and humid air. It was a dangerous environment. Sex workers operating along highways often faced extreme risks. Assaults were common. Many disappeared without investigations receiving national attention. Violence against vulnerable women near interstate systems was already a growing concern for law enforcement during that era. And Aileen Wuornos knew those roads well. She survived through instinct, manipulation, intimidation, and sometimes violence. She carried firearms, she distrusted strangers, she moved constantly. People who met her during this period often described intense mood swings. One moment she seemed funny and talkative, the next furious and paranoid. Nobody understood yet how dangerous that instability would become. In 1986, Aileen met a woman named Tyria Moore at a bar in Florida. The relationship quickly became central to her life. Friends later described Aileen as emotionally dependent on Moore, desperate for affection, and terrified of abandonment. For a brief period, it looked like she might finally settle into some kind of normal life. But financial problems continued, arrests continued, drifting continued, and beneath all of it was growing resentment toward men, toward authority, toward a world she believed had used and discarded her for decades. From a criminological standpoint, this is where many analysts begin debating the Wuornos case. Was she primarily motivated by survival, rage, financial desperation, psychological deterioration, or some combination of all four? Because by the end of the 1980s, investigators believed something inside her had changed permanently. The highways that once represented survival were about to become something far darker. And nobody driving those roads at night knew what was coming. The first man disappeared in December of 1989. At the time, it looked like an isolated case. It wouldn't stay that way for long. The first confirmed killing happened in December of 1989. The man was Richard Mallory, a middle-aged electronics store owner from Clearwater, Florida. When investigators later reconstructed his final movements, they discovered he had been driving through Central Florida shortly before Christmas. Then he vanished. Weeks later, his abandoned vehicle was discovered in another county. Not long after that, his body was found in a wooded area. At first, investigators didn't immediately connect the case to anything larger. Florida saw countless transient crimes involving highways, stolen vehicles, robberies, and disappearances every year. One unexplained death didn't automatically signal a pattern. But then another man disappeared, and then another. The victims varied in age and background, but detectives slowly began noticing similarities. Most had last been seen driving alone. Several vehicles turned up abandoned miles away from where the men were last spotted. Personal belongings were missing. In some cases, witnesses remembered seeing a woman with the victims shortly before they vanished. And the highways kept appearing in every timeline: truck stops, rest areas, late-night bars near interstate exits. Investigators were starting to notice a pattern. What's interesting from a psychological standpoint is how mobility complicates criminal investigations. Crimes spread across multiple counties often delay pattern recognition because departments initially treat them as isolated incidents. That delay gave Aileen Wuornos time. By the middle of 1990, authorities were beginning to realize they weren't dealing with random violence anymore. Ballistics evidence linked multiple scenes together, shell casings matched, firearm patterns repeated. Vehicle thefts connected timelines investigators previously thought were unrelated. The same weapon appeared again and again. And now, law enforcement believed the offender was moving constantly across Florida highways. Meanwhile, Aileen continued drifting between motels, bars, wooded campsites, and roadside locations with Tyria Moore. The two women spent large amounts of cash despite having no stable employment. Witnesses later recalled seeing them driving vehicles that didn't belong to them. That detail changed everything, because once investigators traced stolen property connected to the victims, the case accelerated rapidly. Pawn shops became critical. Several victim belongings had been sold shortly after disappearances. Receipts, signatures, and witness identifications slowly started forming a chain investigators couldn't ignore. And at the center of that chain was Aileen Wuornos. But there was still one major complication: her story. From the moment she became a suspect, Wuornos insisted the killings happened in self-defense. She claimed several men had attempted to assault or attack her after picking her up along the highways. According to her version of events, she feared for her life repeatedly. The problem was that many investigators didn't believe the evidence supported those claims consistently. Some victims had been robbed after death. Vehicles had been abandoned in separate locations. Personal property had been sold. And the shootings themselves often suggested escalation beyond immediate panic. But here's the detail that changes everything. Several people who studied the case later acknowledged that sex workers operating near highways genuinely faced horrifying levels of violence during that era. Assaults were common, reporting systems were inconsistent. Many attacks were never fully investigated, which meant the case became psychologically complicated almost immediately. Was Aileen Wuornos inventing danger to justify robbery and murder? Or had years of trauma and survival conditioned her to perceive every encounter as potentially lethal? That question followed the case from the beginning, and even today, people still argue about the answer. As the investigation intensified, detectives focused increasingly on Tyria Moore. Unlike Aileen, Moore had no history of violent offenses. Investigators believed she might cooperate if pressure increased. They were right. In January of 1991, law enforcement located Moore in Pennsylvania and persuaded her to assist the investigation. Recorded phone calls became a turning point in the case. Detectives instructed Moore to contact Aileen directly. The goal was simple: get her talking. The recordings revealed a version of Wuornos very different from the image she sometimes projected publicly. Instead of appearing fearless or defiant, she sounded unstable, emotional, exhausted, and increasingly paranoid. She trusted Moore completely, and that trust would ultimately help end the investigation. One of the most disturbing elements of the Wuornos case is how isolated her life had become by this stage. Nearly every emotional connection she still depended on centered around one person. That level of dependency often creates desperation when the relationship feels threatened. Investigators understood that. They knew if Moore encouraged surrender, Aileen might listen, and eventually she did. Wuornos was arrested at a motorcycle club in Florida after authorities tracked her movements. By then, the investigation had connected her to multiple deaths across the state. But even after arrest, the contradictions continued. Sometimes she appeared calm and cooperative. Other times she exploded with rage. Sometimes she confessed openly. Other times she changed details or shifted blame. That callback from earlier now becomes important. For years, people had described Aileen as someone who reinvented herself depending on the situation. Vulnerable with some people, aggressive with others, victim one moment, predator the next. Inside interrogation rooms, investigators watched those shifts happen constantly. And that's what made the case so difficult to fully understand, because the evidence clearly pointed toward repeated robbery and homicide. But psychologically, Aileen Wuornos didn't behave like a simple, profit-driven criminal. Her statements often sounded deeply paranoid. At times, she appeared convinced the world was hunting her. During some interviews, she spoke with intense hostility toward men generally, describing years of abuse, fear, and violence. Whether those experiences justified murder was another matter entirely. But investigators increasingly believe trauma, rage, survival instinct, and criminal opportunism had fused together into something extremely dangerous. By this point, the case had become national news. Media outlets across America were now covering the female serial killer story relentlessly. Reporters crowded outside courthouses. Television specials dissected her appearance, sexuality, relationships, and behavior. The public became obsessed, and the closer cameras moved toward Aileen Wuornos, the more unstable she appeared to become. Meanwhile, prosecutors were preparing for trial, and behind the scenes, Moore was about to become one of the most important witnesses in the entire case. The walls were closing in fast. By the time Aileen Wuornos entered the courtroom, America had already decided who she was. Newspapers called her a monster. Television networks turned her into spectacle, and audiences across the country became fascinated by the idea of a woman committing crimes that, at the time, people associated almost exclusively with men. But the deeper investigators and psychologists looked into the case, the harder it became to fit Aileen Wuornos into one simple category, because nothing about her story was simple. After her arrest, Wuornos eventually confessed to multiple killings. In recorded interviews, she described roadside encounters turning violent. She claimed several men had threatened or assaulted her after picking her up along Florida highways. At times, she sounded calm while explaining the shootings. At other moments, she sounded furious, paranoid, completely detached from reality, and that's what makes this case so significant. The interrogations revealed someone whose emotional state shifted constantly. One minute she appeared cooperative, the next hostile and suspicious. Investigators later said conversations with Wuornos could feel unpredictable from one hour to the next. That instability became impossible to separate from the public narrative surrounding the case. Was she manipulating people or psychologically unraveling in real time? What's interesting from a psychological standpoint is how prolonged trauma can distort a person's perception of danger. Individuals exposed to years of violence sometimes begin interpreting ordinary interactions as immediate threats. Their nervous systems remain locked in survival mode even when danger isn't objectively present. But trauma alone does not explain repeated homicide. And that's where the case becomes deeply uncomfortable. Because two realities may have existed at once. Aileen Wuornos may genuinely have experienced violence and abuse throughout her life, and she may also have become a dangerous predator herself. Those ideas are not mutually exclusive. During trial proceedings, prosecutors argued the killings followed a consistent pattern involving robbery, stolen property, and calculated violence. Evidence showed victims' cars and belongings had been taken after death. Pawn shop records and witness testimony supported the prosecution's timeline. The defense focused heavily on Aileen's mental condition and traumatic history, but the jury ultimately sided with prosecutors. One conviction became several. Then came multiple death sentences. Inside the courtroom, Wuornos often appeared volatile. Some days she joked with reporters. Other days she erupted into angry outbursts. Her behavior became increasingly erratic as media attention intensified, and the cameras never stopped watching. That's another reason the case became so culturally significant. America wasn't just consuming a criminal investigation, it was consuming a spectacle. Television programs replayed interrogation footage repeatedly. Tabloids focused on her appearance. Documentaries debated whether she was evil, mentally ill, abused, manipulative, or all of those things at once. The public fascination grew larger than the actual investigation, and in many ways, that obsession reflected broader cultural discomfort surrounding violent women. Male serial offenders had existed in media for decades. Audiences understood the archetype. Aileen Wuornos disrupted it completely. She didn't fit expectations. She was aggressive, but emotionally fragile, angry, but deeply insecure, at times charismatic. At times frighteningly unstable. Even experienced professionals struggle to interpret her behavior consistently. That callback from Chapter 1 now becomes important. For most of her life, Aileen seemed to reinvent herself depending on who stood in front of her. Vulnerable around some people, confrontational around others, defiant for cameras, emotional with Tyria Moore. Cooperative during one interview, explosive during the next. The instability wasn't occasional, it was constant, and over time, it became difficult to tell where performance ended and genuine psychological deterioration began. By the late 1990s, her mental condition appeared to worsen dramatically. During later interviews, she made bizarre statements involving conspiracy, surveillance, and government monitoring. At one point, she claimed prison officials were torturing her with sonic pressure. Some observers believed she was severely mentally ill. Others believed she was manipulative until the very end. Again, the case refused to provide clean answers. And maybe that's why people still discuss it decades later. Because most true crime stories create emotional distance between audience and offender. The bad person feels clearly separated from normal society. Aileen Wuornos felt different. Her life exposed uncomfortable questions about abuse, neglect, homelessness, violence against sex workers, mental illness, and public fascination with damaged people. She became both criminal and symbol at the same time. To understand why, we need to look at one final detail: the highways themselves. For years, Aileen drifted across motels, parking lots, truck stops, and roadside bars without stability, supervision, or meaningful intervention. The same transient lifestyle that helped her survive also made the investigation difficult once the killings began. Victims disappeared across multiple counties. Vehicles appeared in different locations. Witnesses struggled to establish timelines. And because Aileen moved constantly, investigators initially failed to recognize the pattern. That earlier callback now pays off fully. The roads that defined her survival eventually became the roads tied to her destruction. In October of 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection in Florida. Her final statement only deepened the strange mythology surrounding the case. She referenced returning someday like Independence Day aboard a spacecraft with Jesus. Even at the very end, she remained unpredictable. And after her death, the fascination didn't fade. Books continued appearing, documentaries continued releasing. Then came Monster, the film that introduced the case to an entirely new generation. The portrayal earned critical acclaim and reignited public debate over who Aileen Wuornos truly was. Monster. Victim, manipulator, mentally ill drifter, predator shaped by abuse. The truth probably exists somewhere inside all of those descriptions. From a criminological standpoint, the Wuornos case remains important because it challenges simplistic narratives about violent offenders. It forces investigators and audiences alike to confront a difficult reality. People are capable of being harmed by the world and becoming harmful themselves. That does not erase responsibility, but it does complicate understanding. And maybe that's why the case still unsettles people decades later. Not because it offers clear answers, but because it doesn't. If this case resonated with you, I recently covered another investigation involving psychological instability and escalating violence that I think you'll find equally compelling. That video is on screen now, and if you haven't subscribed yet, there's a button right here. I'll see you in the next one.